Good morning. We're going to save the best speech for last, hopefully. I get you guys ready for lunch. Today we're going to be talking about barbecue, in particular beef brisket. So why are we talking about this and what is it? I like to blame my heritage. I'm half Polish, half Norwegian, so I'm descendant of the Vikings, so I like preserving meat. I love eating preserved meats. And the Polish side of me, I love to cook and I love to eat. So I came from my mom, who will cook for 25 regardless of, there's 5 people there, there's 25 she's cooked for. My grandmother was the same way, and on both sides, every get-together was a smorgasbord of food to eat and food to take home. You probably took home more than you even ate when you were there. But it's barbecue in particular is a passion of mine that I developed about 15 years ago. I've always been a big, use the grill to cook your meat outside type of guy. I'm sure all of you guys are. But this passion kind of took over. With my love to eat barbecue, I decided to take that into my passion to start trying my own hand at it. And the brisket is kind of like the pinnacle of the barbecue world. It's the hardest one to conquer. So there was a few casualties along the way. I won't say every brisket turned out perfect, but hopefully after today, after I go through my presentation, some of you guys might feel confident enough to try it yourself, and feel free to contact me if there's any questions while you're in the process. Today we're going to cover the whole gamut of things, different types of smokers that are out there, selecting your brisket, trimming your brisket, rub recipes, the cooking process, slicing, kind of the whole deal. So there's a bunch of different styles of smokers out there. I started out 15 years ago with just a simple dual-purpose grill because my wife wouldn't let me buy what I really wanted. But you can use it as a charcoal grill, and it also has an offset firebox. And how the offset firebox works is you start a fire in there. It's indirect heat source that you can also use to smoke meat with, because the art of smoking meat is providing a low heat, indirect heat source with a smoke source. And usually it's long cook times. Brisket is one of the longest cook times you could probably imagine. It takes over 12 to 18 hours usually. So my first one was very bare bones, very labor intensive. Every brisket, you were a slave to the smoker. You had to put wood chunks in the firebox, maintain a certain temperature in the cooking chamber. And I had enough years of that and finally convinced my wife to, now I'm up to using a wood pellet smoker. It's kind of like the set it and forget it style of smoker. I cheat because I can just set a temperature, the cooking chamber, walk away from it. I have a wireless probe that goes into the meat, so I know when it's done. It alerts me. I'm kind of cruising on cruise control, but I do so many of them that there's no way I could dedicate the time. I don't have the time, number one, anymore to do that. So there's different smokers. You have chamber smokers, you have electric heat sources, you have charcoal heat sources, you can use wood chunks for heat source. They have even ones that burn a pellet that's actually like more of a wood puck, and it just drops them in. My pellet smoker burns specific pellets that are made specifically for smoking meat, because you can't just use any wood pellet that you would use to heat a house. They use different binders. It could put a bad taste into the meat. So the wood pellets that I use are specifically for that. They're binded together just by pressure and steam. There's no added binders to it. It would put probably a bitter taste into the meat if you ever had it. And the biggest secret, I'm going to let you guys know, if you don't, about smoking meat is just proper, it's really just time and temperature. You can't rush it, and you got to maintain a certain temperature. That temperature falls, you're going to extend your cook time. The temperature is too high, you possibly could overcook the meat, and then the meat's done too quick and it doesn't taste right, or it's tough. There's 2 different temperatures that you want to monitor while you're cooking that or smoking your meat. You have your chamber temperature, which is where the actual cooking is happening, and then you want to actually monitor the temperature of the meat, and you can use that you can use a not amp probe, but a meat probe, just the old style one that your mom used, or you can use a wireless one like I have. So you can just place that in the meat. You can have your wireless receiver inside, and you can just monitor it from inside. So it's great for me when it's the middle of January and it's snowing. I don't have to go out there and check it. I just close the smoker up, walk back inside, drink a good ice cold beer, and watch my monitor. The next step in smoking a brisket is selecting the brisket. So I smoke whole briskets. They're also called a packer brisket. You cannot find these at most grocery stores. You have to usually go to a butcher. Costco does carry them. I found them there. But it's a large piece of meat. You're talking a 12 to 18 pound piece of meat that's whole, and it's usually vacuum sealed in a piece of plastic. Now, while you're selecting that meat, you want to be very particular when you look at the color of the meat. You want to make sure it's as fresh as it could be. Some places it's not as fresh as others. So you want to look at the color, make sure it's a nice red color. You don't want to buy one if it's brown at all. Just leave it, go find somebody else to buy it from. And there's another little trick I've learned over the years. You want to buy a brisket that's fresh, that hasn't been frozen. So the way you tell that is you pick the brisket up, you hold it at one end. If it sticks out like a stiff board, put it back. That means it's been frozen, and it's never going to taste right if you do a smoke on it. It's going to taste a lot different. A way you tell of a fresh brisket is you hold it, and it's going to fall down at about 90 degrees, 80, it's just going to flop down. And that's how you know that's the one you want to get. You don't really care too much about the fat content of it. You really want to have more fat, the better. And that's something you can trim after the fact. It doesn't really matter what the fat looks like. You just want to look more for the color of the meat and the freshness of the meat. Two very important things. You can keep it in the fridge at your house if you have room, or you can keep it in a cooler on ice, but you do want to keep it cold up until about 4 to 6 hours before you're ready to cook it. Some people believe you have to have it at room temperature before you put it in a smoker. I don't really subscribe to that. I believe you can leave it out about an hour before you put it in the smoker, and it's just fine. I've not seen a difference on that. When you're trimming your brisket's going to have a fat cap on it, and it varies in thickness from cow to cow and brisket to brisket. It's always going to be different. But what you want to pay attention to is trimming off to make it more of a consistent fat cap. So if it's got an inch fat cap on it, you want to probably trim it down to about a ½ inch as best as you can, and be very careful. I have a stainless steel glove that I use because you don't want to slice your hand off. You're using a very sharp knife, and you're cutting through a very tough piece of meat, and fat is not easy to cut through. So just be very mindful of that. The fat, you just toss it out. It's not used for anything. That other ½ inch of fat is going to be your flavor at the end of everything. We're going to get on to rub recipes. There's a lot of different rub recipes. You can find them online. I like to have a little bit of sweet and a little bit of heat in my recipe. And you can kind of turn up the dial a little bit on the heat. I'll give you some pointers on that. But really the basic building blocks of mine is brown sugar, and you want to get the dark brown sugar. It adds more flavor. You got paprika, which I use a smoked Hungarian paprika. Use coarse kosher salt. You don't want to use just table salt. You want the coarser the better, because it doesn't penetrate the meat as fast. It penetrates it slow, and then it just holds its spot. And then at the very end, you add chili powder. You can vary the spice level on your chili powder. You can use mild all the way to hot or medium. And then you can very, very slightly turn up the heat on it by using cayenne pepper. You can also go overboard with the cayenne pepper, so be mindful of who's going to be eating it and if they like a lot of spice or not. I've overdone it before, and I like spice, and almost killed myself. So after you put your rub together, you mix your rub in a bowl, you have your brisket out on the counter, you're going to take that rub and you're going to put it on every piece of that meat. You're going to rub both sides of it, every edge, make sure you use every bit of that rub, put it on there, and then you're going to wrap the brisket up, either with saran wrap or aluminum foil, and let it kind of chill out in the fridge for about 4 to 6 hours. You really can't put it in there too long. I've gone as long as 12, 13 hours with the rub on it. It just melds into the meat a little bit better. But you can do as least amount of time as 4 hours. I've had good results with that as well. So you're going to want to get your smoker up to temp. So for me, it's as easy as plugging it in, turning the dial to 225, and then wait for it to start smoking and hit its temp. If you're using a charcoal one, you'd have to build your fire. You have to get your wood chips going, make sure that firebox is going good and that your cooking chamber is at the proper temp. Now, when you actually smoke the meat, you're going to want to smoke it at 225 degrees for about an hour and a half per pound of meat. Now, that's just a general guideline. That does not mean that's the Bible. That's why it's very important to check your temperature as well as the time. Use your temp probes so that you make sure you're not opening your smoker to look at it. It doesn't change its position. It doesn't do any good to open it up and look at it. If people want to look at it, smack them on the hand, because every time you open that cooking chamber, you're extending your cook time. You're messing up that whole process of smoking. It's letting out all the smoke, and so you can see it. So you get a probe. Make sure you monitor your temperature with the probe, and that way you'll have a perfect brisket. So you want to make sure any piece of meat, regardless, anything after 6 hours, it's not going to absorb any more smoke. So you can finish the brisket out, smoke it the whole way, but it really doesn't make any difference in the flavor. Usually it just dries it out. So my method is after 6 hours, I just take the brisket off the smoker, I wrap it in foil, usually 2 layers of foil, put it back on the smoker for the remainder of the time. Now I still leave that temp probe in there and just wrap the foil around it. That way the brisket kind of melds in its own juices, the fat's melting through, going through the meat, and then it's just sitting there just kind of basting it naturally the whole time. When your brisket reaches 190 degrees internal temperature, off your temp probe, you're going to pull your brisket off the smoker. You're going to have a couple towels that you don't necessarily care about ruining. And you're going to wrap your brisket in at least 2 towels. And then you're going to put it in a cooler for 2 hours. You can do up to, I've done up to all the way up to 12 hours. Now the purpose of letting it kind of meld in the cooler is so that it all reconstitutes itself back into the brisket, as well as allowing you to actually get its temperature down enough where you can slice it perfectly and it's not like shredding apart on you. You can do that with pulled pork as well. Pulled pork will not pull unless you've kind of let it rest for 2 hours in a cooler. And wrapping it in the towels allows it to cool at a slower pace. Plus it just smells really good in your house. You get everybody ready to eat. So when you're ready, after your 2 hours in the cooler, you're going to pull that brisket out. You're going to unwrap it all, have it on a nice cutting board. And there's actually 2 parts to a brisket. So you have your flat part and your point. And the flat is actually really easy to tell the difference between the two because there's a flat end and then there's a pointed end. So when you start cutting your brisket, you start cutting at the flat, you do your slices as thick or as thin as you want, and then you're going to get to a point in the point of the brisket where you can't really slice it anymore because there's actually 2 pieces of meat. The point's actually sitting on top of the rest of the brisket. So you can separate those two. You can finish slicing the bottom part of the brisket so you have all that sliced, and then you can take that top part. You can try to slice it if you want, or you can just shred it, turn it into a pretty awesome brisket sandwich, something like that. kind of like pulled pork. So in conclusion today, kind of walk through the whole process of doing a barbecue brisket, and I hope that you guys feel confident enough, or if you don't, you can call me obviously, but confident enough that you guys might want to try it on your own, or at least maybe I'll bring one to NTI so you guys can try it and get hooked. But thank you very much.
Excellent.